Hi, I'm Frostallion, and this is my first update video for Frost Death Knight and Legion Alpha. If you are looking for the main video detailing all the changes, you can find it linked here. Okay, let's jump right in and briefly cover the few ability changes before moving on to talents. Remorseless Winter has a 30% snare added to it. It's not particularly strong, but it is an AoE, although you do have to be in melee range for it, so kiting packs isn't really an option. Whilst not a change as such, I've now been able to see that the runic power generated from Frost Fever isn't 5 per tick. It seems to be much more random, seeing anything from 1 to 3 procs in total over the 24 seconds. Being so low is quite disappointing considering that Frost Strike still costs an odd amount of runic power. Death Strike had its healing nerfed to 20% down from 40%. Whilst Frost does have an artifact trait that quadruples this damage during Icebound, it's a big hit to general survivability. I've always AoE'd for questing, but this killed me multiple times on stuff I wouldn't have even worried about before. And with both the damage and healing being so low for the cost, you really don't want to be using this raiding if you can help it. I suppose the biggest news is there is a new ability called Wraithwalk, which increases your run speed by 70% for 2 seconds on a 2-minute cooldown, breaking roots and making you immune to them for the duration, at the steep cost of being unable to cast anything. It looks aimed at PvP because this does little to nothing for PvE. You could try and get some functionality out of it if you could actually use it with any regularity, but the restrictions, duration, and cooldown make this all but pointless. I thought perhaps it was because it was 70% that these restrictions were in place, but the Windwalker monk has Tiger's Lust, which is a 70% sprint for 6 seconds, breaking roots and snares on a 30-second cooldown, to go along with its rolls and flying kicks, and you'd have to assume comparable damage output. That's it for the ability changes. There aren't that many because the spec didn't notice the overhaul. As for talents, there have been a few, starting with increases to rune regeneration. Murderous Efficiency has been increased to a 50% chance to return a rune when consuming Killing Machine. This makes it a lot more appealing and will tie in even stronger with Icy Talons, but it still has the same issues under this resource system. You have no way of controlling runic empowerment to make sure you have runes ready to immediately use Killing Machine, outside of holding runes waiting for a proc, which is evidently a style of gameplay they're trying to move away from. But they haven't provided a way to optimize your Killing Machine consumption, and every time it gets overwritten, it devalues this talent, and you are being needlessly punished for something that isn't entirely your fault. And also, if you remember, they have removed the UI alert to let you know that you even got a proc. With such inefficiencies built in, it appears that there are no expectations on the player to do anything except whack whatever button happens to be available at the time, but I'll talk about all that later. Horn of Winter had its runic power nerfed to 5, down from 15. It wasn't exactly great at 1 rune and 15 runic power, and this hasn't helped it. I don't expect these to be its final numbers, so I can only assume they want people to be testing the other options. Runic Attenuation has been significantly increased, from 20% up to 35%, making the chance Frost Strike procs a rune 33.75%. A nearly 4% increase per strike might not seem as impactful as a 25% increase, but you have to factor in the quantity of Frost Strikes versus Killing Machine procs. And whilst the final answer will inevitably be whichever one gives you the most runes, I prefer Attenuation in theory simply because it is dealing with a resource you have complete control over. This change is also a buff to breath uptime, because it is ticking every second, and every tick has the chance to proc a rune to allow you to keep breath going. It seems rational to try and increase the chance of those ticks returning runes. Breath is still ticking at 12 per second, so Attenuation makes this a 16.2% chance per tick to return a rune. The sheer quantity of ticks pushes me towards this talent because Horn is bad and Murderous Efficiency won't be able to consistently deliver. The next set of changes are across Tier 60. The inevitable scaling back of Abomination's might has happened. In its current iteration, it stuns only lesser creatures and instead dazes players for 5 seconds. This is largely PvP focused, so the only snare it can directly compete with is Chains of Ice, which requires a rune and a global cooldown, and since Chains is magic, it can be dispelled. With Daze being physical, it doesn't have those issues, but you can't control when it triggers. I guess the main flaw is the idea, because it requires melee range to cast Obliterate, and whilst Chains is castable from 30 yards away, let's be realistic, that's about as close as you're ever going to get. Blinding Sleet has been buffed such that damage caused may break the effect. I rounded up several packs of mobs and hit them all with AoE abilities, and the only ones that broke early were being auto-attacked, which makes this pretty good, and as my pick of the tier will be using this until they inevitably nerf it. Flash Freeze has had the first of 2 Game of Thrones inspired name changes, and is now called Winter is Coming. Before you get overly excited, it is a significant nerf to the ability, because only enemies struck 5 times by Remorseless Winter while your pillar is active are stunned for 4 seconds. So instead of Remorseless Winter stunning 3 times a minute, it now stuns once. And I'm afraid it seems impossible to overlay the last 5 and first 5 ticks of 2 Remorseless Winters either end of a single pillar. In Tier 75, Pathetic Magic has been changed to Volatile Shielding. It is the same, except that the explosion damage is now Frost, which is a good change since that should now be affected by Mastery. It would be sad to no longer have a good excuse to stand in fire. Implacable has been removed and replaced with the other Game of Thrones reference, White Walker. When you enter or leave Wraithwalk, all nearby enemies are slowed 50%. This basically boils down to being a radial snare on a 2-minute cooldown. Whilst this does snare on both sides of the same cast, you are unlikely to have moved far enough away to notice. But both of these are still in the same tier as Permafrost, which is as yet unchanged, so I doubt either will be needed at all. Although I do feel bad that both references were used on such disappointing talents. The final change to talents was that Frost Scythe had its melee restriction lifted and is now an 8-yard range, which means you can trigger this without a target, which is helpful for building runic power out of combat. It is also interacting with Killing Machine, so I have been able to see that it does crit across all targets. But given the alternatives, it is unlikely you would delay the cooldown for it, and the only way you can defer a Killing Machine proc is to just let it overwrite constantly, neither of which seem good options. So it looks like it still has only a passing relationship with Killing Machine. Okay, that covers the talent changes. There have been some other bits of news, such as the next tier set bonuses. Since they aren't released yet, I can't test them, so keep in mind this section is a purely speculative exercise. The 2-part is Obliterate has a 15% increased chance to trigger Rhyme. Assuming that it is an additive increase, it will take the chance from 45% up to 60%. Since Rhyme adds 300% damage onto Howling Blast, it quadruples the damage in total. To capitalise on the increased quantity of Rhyme procs, it will very likely promote Freezing Fog over Icy Talons. This will of course increase the comparative damage of Obliterate, and that could push the single rune abilities off single target. Of course, AoE only could be their intended function, with tuning as such regardless of the 2-piece, so there could be no difference to gameplay at all, but without them, there is a very narrow set of abilities for use single target. The 4-part is Howling Blast generates 10 runic power while Rhyme is active. This is a practical set bonus that does tie in with its 2-part. Because Rhyme is a Howling Blast, it is a way of saying that the Howling Blast used on Rhyme acts like you used a rune. In a general sense, this simply increases the total amount of runic power generated throughout a fight, which will of course increase the total frost strikes and in turn runes from runic empowerment. But it is specifically very useful when paired with Breath. Because the main ability of the spec is Obliterate, you have to use it to maintain DPS during Breath, but because it costs 2 runes, and often you don't have them, you hit dead time with only Rhyme left available. And using Rhyme during Breath, you are wasting time on the global cooldown because it isn't generating any runic power to fund Breath, and now it does. So whilst this will undoubtedly help, being forced into using Breath with runic empowerment and an ability that requires 2 runes is always going to be a mess. The other piece of item news was a legendary ring, which gives Empower Rune Weapon an extra charge, and reduces its cooldown by 20%. And it's great, because the extra charge means you can finally use Hungering Rune Weapon with every breath, rather than every other breath. The cooldown reduction takes it from 180 seconds to 144 seconds. This might seem a strange number, but because charges don't regen until one is back, using Hungering every breath will now line up until the 12-minute mark, at which point it falls behind. This translates into having 7 consecutive breaths with Hungering, instead of 4 without the reduction. Okay, that pretty much covers all the updates, but I'd like to take a few minutes to talk a little about mechanics and gameplay, with reference to the previous video. This section isn't strictly speaking an update, it's more esoteric. In the main Frost Alpha review, I gave half of the visuals to the Warlord's dual-wield playstyle with Howling Blast. I knew ahead of time this would be a risk, but I felt it was required of me to put it in. Since then, Blizzard have reiterated that the main ability is Obliterate. So here's a little explanation of what happened. Starting out, I looked at the values of all abilities, and Howling Blast's numbers are so pitiful that I had no expectations of the current dual-wield playstyle surviving. It's clear they're trying to kill it. So I worked on my review from that perspective, and with almost 8,000 words finished, I was about to start recording the audio when I thought I should recheck as I had further upgraded the weapon. I was incredibly surprised to see that with Freezing Fog, Howling Blast was already level with Obliterate's base damage. Does that make Howling Blast better than Obliterate when both are equal? No, because of rhyme. If you have two things that are the same but one has a plus anything modifier to it, that will usually be better. But what surprised me was that with all this effort to push Obliterate at such a low level with bad gear, Howling Blast was already equal. I then went back and edited in the possibility of it surviving, but I admit I might have over-egged it. And the reason is because for all their intentions, they haven't actually made any structural changes, only numerical. As I've said before, rhyme adds 300%, giving a total multiplier of 4. You need such large values of Howling Blast to exceed the opportunity cost, those numbers would never be implemented. But with no multiplier, like it is in Warlords, you don't need to raise Howling Blast damage much beyond what it is now for it to become dominant again. So really the only thing keeping Obliterate as the primary ability is rhyme. And that is both important and awkward, because rhyme is now the dial that determines your priority system. Any significant reductions to it, and you could see the switch back to Howling Blast spam, or worse, any smaller changes falling into a grey area in between. But irrespective of this, with values this high, rhyme's greatest gameplay impact is on how you AoE. With rhyme dealing 4 times the damage of a single Howling Blast, and Obliterate costing 2 runes, it is the same problem as trying to multiply out single target. You simply cannot match the opportunity cost until you get into very large numbers of adds, since it is effectively a chance for 4 Howling Blasts off 2 runes. But as it is a percentage chance, we can get a rough idea. In my gear, a simple comparison of Obliterate plus 45% of rhyme versus 2 Howling Blasts break even at 22 targets. Even at 10 targets, rhyme is significantly ahead, but your runes are a limited resource, so if you don't get a proc, you lose a large chunk of damage. So whilst the opportunity cost is smaller at higher numbers, adds don't live very long, so as more adds die, you are losing ever-increasing amounts of your potential damage by not using Obliterate, all in order to gain the guaranteed damage of Howling Blast. But if you do switch to Obliterate, and don't get a proc, you wasted guaranteed damage. And that doesn't come across as particularly inspiring, because you're being punished for being unlucky. It's the same feeling as constantly clipping the wrong ability with Killing Machine. But they can't dial rhyme back too much, otherwise they break their intended ideals for gameplay single target. The only way I can see for them to escape this is to increase the AoE component of Howling Blast to compensate, which is highly doubtful. But if that doesn't happen, you won't have Howling Blast as a reliable filler AoE. The vast majority of your damage will be coming from Scythe, Remorseless Winter, Glacial Advance, and most importantly, luck. But speaking of these new abilities, they bring their own mechanical concerns. It is possible that they are not intended for use single target and will be changed in such a way later. Currently, however, they either exceed or almost match the total damage of a normal Obliterate with a rhyme proc at half the cost. So what happens to rune mechanics when you add in all these short-term cooldowns? Well, you get roughly 5 sets of 3 runes over 30 seconds, with a set of 3 at 0, giving 15 runes in total. Scythe has a cooldown of 6 seconds, so it would take up 6 runes, meaning of the 15 runes, 9 are remaining. Remorseless Winter has a cooldown of 20 seconds, so 2 runes, 7 are now remaining. Glacial Advance is 12 seconds, which is another 3 runes, so of the 15 runes, there are 4 left, meaning that in 30 seconds of rune regen, you can only cast 2 Obliterates. The rest of the runes are entirely taken up by new abilities. Anything you want to cast outside of just mindlessly cycling cooldowns has to come from runic empowerment. And if you assume 9 Frost Strikes with runic attenuation, that would only be an extra 3 runes, for 7 runes in total. The entire scope for Obliterate is only 3 or maybe 4 every 30 seconds. But ignore all damage from abilities for a moment. Just look at the pieces of the puzzle and try to find the best way they fit together. If there is a minimum of 4 runes in 30 seconds, with the rest being a random number of additional runes, which is mechanically superior, Obliterate or Howling Blast? For me, the determining factor is how these 4 runes become available for use. They are not being left in pairs, they are single runes spread out over time. If you wanted to spend them on Obliterate, you have to wait for either the next set of runes or for Runic Empowerment to deem you worthy enough to give you another one. But even when you get 2, more often than not you can't spend them because that would delay the cooldown of one of the new abilities. And because you can't bank runes or trust Empowerment to return one, in order not to delay anything, it means that even if you have 2 runes and could cast Obliterate, you will instead have to sit and wait. So you can now only cast Obliterate when you have 3 runes or an imminently recharging set. That's not anywhere close to intuitive. But if Howling Blast was the dominant ability, with 2 runes you know you can hit the next single rune cooldown, and so you can immediately spend any straggling runes. Less downtime, no delays. And having played it for several hours, knowing it was mathematically inferior to get the footage for the first video, I found it does work better. But we haven't even started looking at Killing Machine. Say you only want to use Killing Machine on Obliterate instead of Scythe. Obliterate is behind all these cooldowns that need to be hit. The cooldowns don't wait. The runes aren't there. The only way you can get Killing Machine with Obliterate is to delay 1 or more of the cooldowns. From the very beginning, Frost is getting in its own way. Again. Which means that if you were to look at the comparative damage between a proc being used on Obliterate versus Scythe, regardless of however much bigger Obliterate is, you have to deduct the damage lost from delaying the cooldowns. But Scythe, whilst smaller, just consumes the proc and carries on the cycle. It is entirely plausible that they don't want to have some or all of these abilities being used single target, and it's true that the fewer there are, the more reliable Obliterate becomes. But well, I could spend a good 20 minutes talking about the logical fallacies in Frost mechanics, but I'll spare you. Because really it's possible to track these problems, along with pretty much every other mechanical issue, back to Runic Empowerment. I have no intention of spreading misinformation in my content, so I can only apologise if I misled anyone as to the viability of continuing the playstyle of Warlords, but I hope you can see why I felt it was necessary to cover the possibility. And of course, you never know, they might turn some dials before launch, reversing the situation. But until then, we are where we are. I guess that pretty much covers it really. Just a couple of final things. The night I released my Unholy update, there was a new level 110 server released with fully completed artifact weapons. Whilst the passives have been disabled, I've answered the majority of the questions I had, so the next videos will be the Frost and Unholy artifacts. And after those, I have played through all of the other DPS specs and I will begin to look at some of the other classes. I think starting with Demonology Warlock. Also, I know I said I was going to be doing XCOM 2, and I really wanted to, but unfortunately I'm one of the many who experienced severe graphical issues with it. But hopefully they will have fixed their game by the time the new content comes out so I can share it with you. In the meantime, I'll have a look around for something to put up in between Legion videos. As ever, please feel free to leave any comments or questions. Thanks for watching.